Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Director of Performance Solutions at the English Institute of Sport, Mark Jarvis. Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to episode 38 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today we've got Mark Jarvis on the line, who is Director of Performance Solutions at the English Institute of Sport. So he's the first guy we've had on for the EAS, so really interested and excited to hear what he has to say. So today we look at triathlon, because Mark's got a book, The Fourth Discipline, which is focused around triathlon. So we look at strength training for endurance athletes, and move on to discuss plyometrics with team sport athletes and endurance athletes, which links in nicely to the PhD he's doing. So it's a really interesting chat with Mark, and he does go into some really good detail with regards to plyometrics. We also discuss his book, which is coming out at the start of July, as we mentioned in the chat. So if you are interested, you can pre-order that now on Amazon, and I'll put a link to that on the site. Just before we get going, I just want to draw your attention to the South Yorkshire Performance Seminar, which is going on the 1st of July. So that's going to include Ross Burberry from Nottingham Forest, Luke Jenkinson from Sheffield United, and Paul Bauer from Barnsley Football Club. So it'll be a really interesting evening, plenty of time to chat, plenty of time to listen to these guys speak, and it'll be a really good evening. So if you want to check that out, I'll put a link on paceyperformance.co.uk. If you want to check out all the links that are mentioned in the episode, just go to paceyperformance.co.uk/38 and enjoy the chat with Mark Jarvis. Hi guys, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So today I've got Mark Jarvis on the phone. So just before I get Mark in, I just want to thank him for his time to be with me on a Tuesday night, and get him to do a little bit of an introduction, experience, education, and what he's currently doing. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you, mate. Nice to be here.
Pleasure. So education first, background first. What are you currently doing?
Education was sort of, I guess, miseducation really. So, I actually left school when I was 15 with 3 GCSEs to my name, with no real direction, and decided that a clothes shop was the way to go. So it actually took me a few years to kind of get my head together and work out what I actually wanted to do. But I was kind of always interested in this kind of stuff. You know, I kind of discovered training around about the age of 14, 15, and just loved the idea of kind of self-improvement. And, I was pretty rubbish at sports across the board at school. And so the idea that I could actually do something to make myself better was quite exciting. I finally kind of got back into it at about the age of 20 and went off to college. And it was, I think, like a lot of us in this profession, when you find something that you really love, then all of a sudden you get motivated to do it and actually apply yourself. And that was the kind of the trigger that I required. So kind of got back onto some kind of straight and narrow educational path. BTEC diploma, not exactly scaling the heights of academia, managed to get myself through a bit of blagging onto a degree at Kingston University. So I did sports science there, did okay on that. Went off to Loughborough, did my MSc in exercise physiology. Left there expecting the world to fall at my feet and for there to be a bidding auction on my services. Found out that wasn't quite the case, so I did a couple of years in London personal training before I finally got my first job in sport, which was up at Heriot-Watt University. And I sort of split my time between Scottish squash, university scholarship students, and Hearts Football Club, originally with the under-19s and the under-21s. So I did that for a couple of years, absolutely loved it. And that was around about 2002 when S&C jobs in this country were first emerging. So there wasn't really anyone with S&C in their job title at that point. Everyone was a sports scientist still. And then after 2 years there, I got onto the internship program, as it was then, at EIS, starting up in the northeast in Newcastle, with some names that will be familiar to most of your listeners, I imagine. So back then, Jeremy Moody was the regional lead, who's now down at UWIC, runs the MSc in strength and conditioning. The other S&C coach there was Jared Deacon, who's now in Edinburgh, long-time sort of EIS stalwart and athletics coach. And Duncan French was also working for us part-time. So, quite a few good guys to be working with way back in the day there. Did a year on the internship there, which was fantastic, before moving down to Birmingham about 10 years ago now, when I know Nick Grantham's been on your podcast before. Nick took me under his wing down there, and I had 10 years with EIS now. Started off down the traditional sort of multi-sport route, just working with athletes across the board, which is a kind of foundation that I recommend for all aspiring S&C coaches, and just like athletes, not specialising too soon. Moved into quite a bit of track and field work, specifically with high jumpers around the time of Beijing, around 2008. Quite a lot of work with wheelchair basketball as well, leading their sort of national S&C program. And then I was regional lead for a couple of years before I went off to West Brom. So I did 3 seasons with West Brom, which was kind of, going full circle, having started with Hearts right back at the beginning. Then, as I viewed it, I kind of went off and learnt my trade with the EIS, really, to be honest with you. That's where I kind of felt like I got half decent. And then going back and applying that with a much more sort of mature mindset and a much more open view of what you can do in football. So 3 really good fun seasons at West Brom. I was fortunate enough to be able to leave on my own terms, which is not a luxury everybody gets in football. So I got out before I got fired. Not that was on the cards, I hasten to add. And then I moved into the Performance Solutions team at EIS, which was a new venture, which is a directorate that I now lead in my current job.
Interesting.
That's the long potted history lesson.
Ah, that's cool. So you mentioned right at the start that there was. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, you got a little quieter. I've got you again now.
Okay. So you mentioned at the start there was kind of sports scientists and not S&C coaches.
Yeah.
Where do you see that kind of role of an S&C coach going, with so many kind of people coming out of university with strength and conditioning masters or strength and conditioning degrees? Where do you see that role, kind of the path that's going to lead for kind of S&C coach in 2020, say?
I think that's a really good question, actually. In some ways, I think it could go back towards the direction that it came from in the first place. So we were all kind of generalists back in the day. I think in football, you could have been employed in football for the last 15 years and had 5 different job titles for doing exactly the same thing. So, originally you would have been just a fitness coach. Then everybody wanted to be called a sports scientist, and now most jobs tend to be advertised as sports scientist / strength and conditioning coach, which I've got no problem with at all if you're actually going to be a strength and conditioning coach. I think there is a move to being a little bit more of a specialist generalist again now, though. Partly through economic reasons. I think I see it quite a lot in Olympic sport, that people are moving outside of an absolutely strict paradigm of being a strength and conditioning coach. I know certainly within EIS that tends to be the case. We went down a route at one point where we were very much, not by any kind of mandate or rule, but it was very much our work was done in the gym, in the weight room, sort of expanding a bit more out to the track. And now I think there's guys that do all sorts of things under that banner of strength and conditioning. So I think it will probably go, certainly within my world, with the Olympic world, it will go broader again. Possibly the other way in football would be, certainly my suggestion would be the way it should go. I think too many people are trying to wear too many hats in football, and I felt that was kind of how I could bring some value by being a specialist gym coach rather than a guy who's probably best at doing warm-ups and drills. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to someone who does that, but I don't think that you can be an expert in all areas, and I think that's something slightly different that the likes of me and Duncan and Nick, who've all worked in football in recent years, have probably brought to that world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the best title that somebody's put on a covering letter or a CV to try to differentiate themselves from the S&C kind of S&C coach banner?
I'm not sure I've seen anything particularly brilliant. I mean, anybody young and aspiring out there, I would just say, please don't think that calling yourself director and CEO of a company with your own surname and a one-man band is fooling anybody, because that's old very, very quickly. For me, I'm actually quite a big fan of creative job titles, as long as they creatively and accurately describe what you do better. So in recent years, there's been famous examples of people called head of marginal gains, fairly out there things like that. But if that gives you a better indication of what they do, and it actually gives a little bit of freedom for them, because sometimes you can be constrained by your job title, can't you? That people have a fixed idea in their head of what a strength and conditioning coach will do, and therefore they expect you to do that rather than looking at the skills you bring. I know I've certainly seen that in I won't name the sport, but a sport that felt that they didn't need to get stronger and they didn't need a strength and conditioning coach, and they thought that would all be, exclusively Olympic lifts. And when we took the word strength out of the job title and said it's just a conditioning coach, they couldn't sign up quick enough. They're not all ours aren't conditioned. So it can be a little bit of an albatross. But I think creativity in the right way is good. As I suggested in some sports, just bolting on the latest fashionable title is, does my head in slightly. It doesn't advance the industry, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So just to move it on to the actual work that you do. So triathlon. So you've got a book, obviously around the fourth discipline. So just want to tell us a bit about, how that came about and, why triathlon?
Okay, well, I'm 41 years old now, Rob, which means that most of my mates get in lycra that they've got no business getting into on the weekends. And so having been a sort of, albeit very average endurance athlete all my life, all of a sudden my mates are now ditching football and getting involved in that sort of thing. So you know how it is, you go around their houses at weekends, you see the magazines lying around. I started dabbling with it a little bit as well and looking at some of the popular textbooks, but the ones that are always up there on Amazon. And for the most part, they're pretty good. They're pretty helpful and provide a good structure until you get to the bit about resistance training, and it's just absolutely woeful. So you get a 2-page article trying to teach someone how to run with a couple of poorly drawn stick figures, which is clearly ludicrous that someone's going to read that and become a better runner. You get something in there that's written by someone who's grown up in triathlon and not really had any experience of strength and conditioning or worked with a proper strength and conditioning coach. And again, it'll be a sort of a 2-page spread with some cartoons of someone doing some leg extensions and some squats. And you think people are actually going to go out and look at that and try and take it on. And subsequently, when I've gone out into the world, I've seen examples of that, of how bad it is. So I would sit there and, being an opinionated young chap, point out how much better I thought I could do, and people would say, well, why don't you then? So kind of just to prove a point, that's exactly what I did. So I just went off and wrote that book over the course of about 6 months, primarily because I thought not only is it done really badly so far, but I really believe that there's massive merit in using strength and conditioning to aid triathlon and endurance athletes in general. But unlike some sports where without being overly simplistic, to some extent you can just get stronger and more powerful and you probably get a performance gain. It's certainly not that simple in triathlon. I think you can certainly improve your performance, but you've got to know what you're doing. It's not just going to happen by chance or by going to the gym. So that was the catalyst for writing the book, and hopefully it seems to be reasonably well received. So
yeah, cool. So like you mentioned, the 40-year-old guy pulling on his Lycra for the first time, or maybe not for the first time, interested in kind of the aspect of strength and conditioning, and delve into that a little bit. Where would you kind of guide people? What would be the kind of first thing that you'd say, okay, let's introduce you to XYZ? What would XYZ be?
I think fundamentally it'd just be about looking at mechanics. Just getting people to move as best we can. When I've gone around presenting to triathlon clubs and various groups on this subject, the most obvious thing is you look at the amount of money these people are happy to spend on a bike and the precision engineering required, and then you look at them trying to run down the road and you're thinking, well, what would the bike equivalent of your running gait be? It'd be like a clapped out old postman's bike with a buckled wheel and a wonky saddle. It really would. So it seems madness to obsess over the mechanics of one of those 3 disciplines and completely ignore them on another one. Which is actually free as well, by the way, rather than having to buy an expensive bike. So that would be fundamentally, if you did nothing else, I would address that. I think, most of the literature around endurance training, even though there are some good studies demonstrating an improvement, they're generally based on just getting stronger. Now, for me, that's the icing on the cake. Like if you've got to the point where you've developed good mechanics, and then you can start to add physical qualities to movement qualities, then you're really cooking on gas. But I don't think any of the studies in the literature really look at because it's harder and it's longer term, and it's not as easy to quantify as just getting stronger. But I think you can gain an enormous amount by focusing on that area. Similarly, just applying some basic training principles. So because the aforementioned magazines and books that I spoke about do reference strength and conditioning, albeit not particularly well, most triathletes seem to be signed up to the idea that they have to, or not they have to, but they would benefit from engaging in some level of strength and conditioning. Although, again, when you ask them to take a step back from it, they don't apply the same basic training principles that they would to the rest of their training. So you ask them, okay, what do you do for strength and conditioning? Oh, I like to do some bodyweight squats, some lunges, some press ups, some planks, etc. The usual sort of stuff that you'll hear. Okay, how long have you been doing that for? 2 years. How many times have you changed it? None. That's literally the equivalent of going, what do you do for triathlon? I go for a 4-mile run at the same speed every Monday. I do a swim on a Tuesday, bike on a Wednesday, and repeat times 52. There's no progression, overload, variety, any of those sorts of principles. So as I said, they are first principles of training. So it's just kind of, when you point these things out to people, it seems really obvious, but it's not applied in practice.
Mm-hmm. So just to get some kind of meat onto that, the kind of mechanics side of things. So you've got a guy who comes to you, stood in front of you, and you have in your mind that you want to improve his mechanics. What would be the first thing that you would do?
The first thing that I'd do would be to ask him about where he feels the greatest gains can come from. You can make various arguments about whether you apply a standard template model to how people should move, but in general, I think you can apply reasonable logic to having mobility around the major joints. But asking them where they feel they can gain the most in their performance is insightful, and it probably means you're going to get a little bit more buy-in, and it's the things that they're trying to work on. A lot of the time, I'll just get them to go through some basic form of movement assessment, which would clearly include looking at how they run. And one of the fundamental points of that being that people, when you see someone running down the street, arms and legs flailing all over the place and leaning forward, it goes back to why those articles in magazines are flawed. That person isn't running that way because they've misunderstood the technical model. They don't think that you run waving your arms around and with your knees inwardly rotated, etc., etc. But they just haven't, for the most part, they haven't got the physical capacity to produce the right shapes. Whether they don't have the strength or the endurance to hold them, whether they don't have the mobility to achieve them in the first place. So I think just giving people the raw capacity to produce the right shapes is critical. To some extent, I think you can hypothesize with some degree of validity that if you don't even need to teach any running mechanics or do any drills. If you just give people the capacity, they'll sort of self-select the right shapes. Because to a great extent, you're undoing daily life, aren't you? That's part of the challenge, particularly if you consider the cohort of people that you're going to be working with in triathlon, that they're typically middle-aged, middle-class, white-collar workers who spend all day sat down trying to earn enough money to go and buy a more expensive bike, but paradoxically at the same time screwing up their own running mechanics. But yeah, that's life.
No, cool. So just taking that on a level, you've got someone that's a bit more advanced, and they're looking to improve their kind of movement efficiency. What's your kind of take on what movement efficiency means, and how would you go about improving that?
That's a very good question. So I think once you've gone beyond the basics, like as I said before, do you slavishly work towards a fixed model of how everyone should move and what depth they should be able to squat to, etc., etc. And I think then you have to start to just break down their performance of, okay, where do we think the greatest gains lie? Is that through, is there a reasonable hypothesis looking at the way you currently move? So say, for example, let's stick with the run. Someone says, I want to improve my run time by working on my mechanics. I think you have to evaluate that fundamental question. What do your mechanics currently look like? don't know of a way of putting a number on it, but just through intuition, if nothing else, watching them run and how much potential gain do we think is there, and making a comparison on that with their physical qualities. So if their physical qualities are poor, but their mechanics seem adequate, then there's a reasonable basis to suggest, well, let's start to actually, put some capacity into your engine rather than just making you move better.
Cool. So how would, I mean, you've obviously got 3 completely different disciplines.
Yeah.
If kind of say a regular S&C coach, how much knowledge of each of the 3 disciplines should there be before taking on someone like that?
I don't think you need a massive knowledge of those 3 disciplines. I think you can work with the coach and their athlete as well. They'll have a reasonable view, and again, you need to be aligned with what they're trying to achieve. And you can't sort of go off unilaterally and decide where you think the greatest gain is to come from. I think you need to have some kind of idea of what contributes to good performance. So in swimming, for example, the idea that essentially it's ability to produce propulsive force competing against drag. So creating the best positions which reduce drag whilst also creating as much propulsive force as possible will basically tell you how fast you're going to swim. I don't consider myself an expert in swimming by any stretch of the imagination, but if you can grasp those basic principles, then I think you're pretty much there.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I just want to kind of move it on to something else that I put to you the other day, which is plyometrics, which is something that you're obviously working on at the minute. But just tapping into your kind of background in team sports, maybe with football as the main one. Talk us through your kind of thoughts on plyometrics and in team sports and the kind of the experiences you've had and how you progress them, how you regress them.
Okay. I think sometimes I don't want to use the word expert here because that doesn't sound particularly modest, but when you start to develop an expertise in an area, unfortunately it means that you tend to recognise the limitations of that area more and more, and therefore you use it less and less. And there's a great quote in Super Training, something along the lines of one of the mistakes of proponents of plyometric training is that they often fail to recognise that there may be sufficient plyometric activity in the training program already. Something along those lines, and I think that's very true of team sports and football. So for me, I think if you look at the activity, if we take a broad view of what plyometrics is, it's not just jumping off boxes and bounding in a very confined environment, and it's my definition of plyometrics would be anything which overloads the stretch shortening cycle over and above what you normally do. So what you need to do to overload that for a triathlete is clearly very different to a triple jumper, for example, and that sort of leads to why those methods might be quite different. So for team sports, where is that stretch shortening cycle going to be challenged? Obviously, that's going to be at high velocity sprinting, changes of direction through longer stretch shortening cycles, various sort of jump challenges, primarily unilateral, etc., etc. So those are the stretch shortening cycle actions that we would seek to overload. And I think by clever drill construction and good monitoring of training, you can actually achieve all of those quite nicely without actually, quote unquote, doing plyometrics. And I ran a very small pilot study with a few young players once. I took them down the track and where we've got the force plates embedded, and I got them to do some sort of standard classic plyometric exercises. And I got them to do some of the sort of football actions that we just described. And what was really interesting is a couple of the plyometric actions, the impact spike when they landed was slightly higher. But for the most part, certainly the propulsive component, including the eccentric phase, so that's an active braking rather than a passive landing, the curve was almost exactly the same for the footballing actions as it was for the plyometric actions. And therefore, my view on that would be, the idea of plyometrics outside of track and field, in general, is that you're sacrificing some degree of specificity because you're performing movements slightly different to those performed in the game, but the trade-off is that you gain intensity. But if you look at that from the evidence that I've collected there, you haven't gained any intensity, and so you've traded your specificity with nothing in reward, nothing in return. And so you're probably better off just doing the actions. Allied to that, you've also got the fact that those players are probably going to be significantly more engaged. If you keep putting crosses into the box, for example, so one of the exercises we asked them to do was run in and then just leap naturally as they would do to finish a header, which was pretty much the same as a bound in terms of the force curve. So you can probably get away with doing that for quite a long time with a reasonable level of engagement and motivation, because they want to get to the ball. Whereas asking them to do the same thing in a dry setting of just continually bounding, and they're not necessarily going to see the relevance, you might start to struggle. So I think if you can control those things, and understand the plyometric volume, I don't necessarily think that you need to add a great deal in there, certainly not in terms of performance enhancement. Where I've probably used plyometrics more frequently would be in low-level rehab settings, where I don't think it's used as effectively as it could be.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask you something then, but I'll ask you that at the end. So how do you think that could be used more effectively from your point of view? What from the rehab prehab stuff.
Okay, I'm generalising here and speaking quite a lot from my own specific experience. But with that caveat, there's seems to be a massive amount of unstable surface training that goes on within football, particularly with regard to ankles. And I've had this debate with a lot of physios, and there were some great physios that I worked with at West Brom. We had some fantastic debate. And one physio in particular kind of agreed with me, the whole debate about feedback versus feed forward mechanism of when you land on the ground. So obviously if you're on an unstable surface, you're relying on a feedback mechanism to tell you where your foot and ankle are and then correct it, as opposed to in a real life situation where you'd have to pre-activate in a feed forward mechanism. And so fundamentally, the motor pattern that you're developing is fundamentally different. So that was my sort of theoretical argument against doing lots of unstable surface work. But I had another guy there who agreed with me in theory, but found that he just got worse results when he took that stuff out and just kept it in. And therefore we kind of both came to the conclusion that actually a little bit of both, and the increase in activity that you're going to get around the ankle stabilizers is probably worthwhile, even though it's non-specific, and so the combination come together. But I think if I hadn't added in a lot of low-level plyo stuff, the balance would have been skewed. Another thing that I found hugely useful was clearly knee pain is pretty common in football. Frighteningly now, the amount of volume that they play in academies when they're younger, you're getting more and more lads with osteochondral defects and patellar tendon issues at a young age. And I found that they get caught in a vicious cycle quite often, whereby they start to get a little bit of quad inhibition through patellar tendon pain, which then leads them to get into more disadvantageous positions, so that the knee will start to glide forward, thus placing greater strain on the patellar tendon and more damage, more pain, more inhibition, etc., and so it goes on. And so by introducing some really nicely controlled low-level plyometrics to kind of overcome that inhibition, to have like a disinhibitory effect prior to going out training, they then don't get into those positions, they don't accumulate the damage, etc.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I'll just go back to what I was going to ask. With the crossing and finishing, that's quite interesting to me. So traditionally you do plyos in the gym, and then all of a sudden you're saying, okay, we're not going to do that in there. We're gonna go outside and we're going to do something that traditionally a finishing coach or a technical coach would normally do. What was there any conflict there? Did you how did you work that?
I don't think you even need to do them separately, to be honest with you, Rob. I think if you with the amount of GPS or not just GPS, the accelerometer monitoring that players have typically now, or even if you're working at a low level and you don't have that, you can just count stuff to some extent, although that does present a bit of a challenge. But yeah, I don't think you need to necessarily even put on a special session. You know, you might be doing small-sided gains and go, okay, well, how many changes of direction over a certain threshold does a player carry out? How many sprints over a certain velocity do they carry out? And you can start to accumulate a plyometric load without it ever being anything other than the normal session. And the other thing, you know, a physio who's now in Australia that I used to work with, a guy called Mark Jarvis, you know, came out with a simple but brilliant quote before about what he thought S&C should look like, and that was just, you know, give them what they don't already get. You know, and I think that there's huge value in that.
Yeah, I like that.
Trying to do more of the stuff that already exists in football. It's like, well, they've already got that, and it, you know, similar to the plyometric example, really, like they're already doing that, but it's better because it's actually football. So don't just inject a watered down version of that. Give them something discrete or distinct that they don't already get. High duration contractions with high protein synthesis, low protein degradation strength training, which is not the kind of muscle stimulus that you're going to get playing football, is probably of quite a lot of value. And if you look at, you know, I always refer to the work of Cormy from, you know, sort of 4 or 5 years ago, looking at do we go down a strength bias or do we go down a power bias? You know, most of these people, or the majority of these players, are effectively doing some form of power training every day because it's an aggressive, high-intensity sport. What they aren't doing is any kind of strength training. And so that's the gaping black hole. And so the way I look at it is, if you just did a study and you only did strength training, it probably wouldn't have a great effect on your football performance. But the fact that you're combining that strength training with football, you kind of can get, the way I see it, you can give them a fairly general stimulus in the gym, and then they go out on the training pitch and they kind of turn it into football. You know, if you do nothing more than just give them some more satellite cells and they go out and it, you know, it helps them get better that way. I don't think you have to be too clever in terms of the conversion.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So plyometrics, how does that differ for your kind of endurance athletes, for the guys that you're with triathlon?
Okay, so for these guys, again, that would, I think there's loads of value, but it would go back to that really simplistic definition of plyometrics in just simply, can you overload the stretch shortening cycle? So if you're, you know, club level triathlete, you might go out, you might run 6.5, 7 minute miles. So, you know, so clearly running is the activity where you're going to get the most impact on a stretch shortening cycle over and above swimming and cycling. So we're pretty much talking about running. So essentially, running any faster than 6.5 or 7 minute miles is going to overload the stretch shortening cycle. You know, so any kind of sprints, strides, etc. For me, I don't think you need to do a huge deal more than that. I don't think you need to be any cleverer, because again, it goes back to that question: why are you going to sacrifice specificity if you're for intensity? So with the football example, you weren't gaining intensity. Well, you can continue to gain intensity with other exercises for triathlon, but you don't need to. You can, by running faster, you can ramp up your intensity and absolutely keep specificity, save for a slight change in mechanics, which probably doesn't really matter too much. And so, yeah, I think fundamentally that you can survive on that. Combine that with some, like I say, some good drills for other stuff, for postural control, etc. And I think you've got a half decent plyometric program. What I wouldn't do is get to the point where you've actually increased intensity so much that it starts to become irrelevant. So I had there was one triathlon club which will remain nameless that I went and did a little bit of work with, and there was a guy there who had so much gear, it was unbelievable. You know, he had, like, his bike looked like a Ferrari. He had all the clothes. He'd believe it or not, he'd actually closed down his son's playroom and converted it into a training room for himself, which was an interesting move.
I absolutely live for those guys. I love them guys.
It turned out the guy had been doing it 4 months, which I was quite surprised by. And then, and this is when I told you I wasn't going to rant at the start. I'm going to rant, and I said I was going to call people out. But Joel Friel, who is undoubtedly a brilliant triathlon coach, but is not a strength and conditioning coach, had been extolling the virtues of plyometrics for triathletes. And this guy had been reading up on it, and had ordered himself some drop boxes on the internet, up to about 60 centimeters. Now, this guy couldn't do a bodyweight squat without having an absolute disco and his knees knocking together. He had no business whatsoever jumping off a box like that. And to be honest with you, regardless of what his squat looked like, I'm not really sure there's any benefit in a very high intensity double leg exercise like that for a low to moderate running speed with a unilateral gait pattern. I think that's pretty loose, to say the least. Just because it's plyometrics doesn't mean it will work for you. So I think if you go with those simple criteria of understanding what the activity is going to give you, rather than kind of starting off with your classic sort of plyometrics textbook and taking exercises out of there, I think that's something that we're still trying to overcome. Like, we're getting there incredibly slowly, but plyometrics was developed, I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, but in the 1960s for Russian track and field athletes who were all doped up to the eyeballs. Those are the facts, and what those athletes required and what those athletes can tolerate is not the same as everybody else. And those coaches at the time sensibly designed exercises which were appropriate to overload them. Like I said, if you're a high jumper or you're a triple jumper, and you're smashing huge ground reaction forces, but when you're going down the runway or running around a curve, then you need to do something fairly aggressive to overload it. But that doesn't apply to the vast majority of athletes that the likes of you and I will work with.
Mm-hmm. So, am I right in thinking that you're doing a PhD?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, which is on quantifying plyometrics.
Yes.
Correct. Cool. So, do you want to talk to a little bit about your PhD and how what you found so far with regards to quantifying what I've just been talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, it came about because I kind of feel like as strength and conditioning coaches, we always used to criticise physiologists back in the 90s, when you'd have the VO2 max on a shot putter, and you basically measure what the things that we had tools to measure rather than what actually counted. And yet I see this huge mismatch between what we measure and quantify in the gym versus what we measure and quantify in plyometrics. So now we've got force plates, linear encoders, all kinds of ways of measuring what we do, and we can describe volume load pretty accurately and reasonably creatively in the gym and have a good measure of what our athletes have done. And yet we seem to just be happy to count contacts on plyometrics and broadly describe them as high or low intensity. So it kind of felt like there was a gap in the market, if you like. Allied to that, there was a couple of key studies which really prompted me to start thinking about it by Jensen and Eben from about 2008. And what they looked at were they started looking at different methods of quantifying intensity. So they did the standard sort of stuff with force plates and some reasonably interesting metrics like eccentric rate of force development, which are reasonably compelling now, I think, still. They also looked at muscle activation stuff with EMG. And there was one particular one where they found counter movement jump had the highest EMG compared to drop jump, and I didn't particularly think the conclusion in that paper was very good, but I thought the findings, or certainly the results, were really, really interesting. And what that brought home to me was I'd seen non-strength power athletes in the gym that I'd worked with and other people who worked with doing classic plyometrics, adhering to the age-old imagine you're jumping onto hot coals, and they'd be patting on the floor with a very quick contact, but a contact of almost no meaning. So very little force being produced, very little resultant height. And I kind of felt like that was a little bit of an epiphany of, well, actually, why don't we just change this around? Why don't we worry less about the total force production and more about the muscular activation for someone who isn't able to produce a great deal in that amount of time? So yes, it's nice to get off the floor quickly, but only if you actually do something with it. So I went down this route of looking at quantifying plyometric intensity, did some stuff on methodology in the first place. Probably the most interesting stuff, well, for me anyway, and you always got to be wary because at PhD you fundamentally find it more interesting than anybody else on the planet. It can make you a bit of a sociopath, but I collected some pilot data on some high jump guys that I'd worked with historically, And actually, it was a weird twist of fate that the first study, when I tried to synchronize EMG, high-speed video, and force plate data, and if anybody's ever considering doing that, I would strongly advise them against it, because that technology will stitch you up and make you look like an idiot every time. We had some problems with the data when I collected it first time around on elite guys, and it went wrong a couple of times, and I was starting to use up all my credits, and I was conscious that I needed them for further studies later on. So I did it, the actual data for study 1 on some university students in time-honoured fashion. And then when you compare the data, so if you took, so impulse and peak force are probably the most compelling variables for me, for various reasons for quantifying intensity, which probably won't surprise a lot of people. But essentially, when you look at the numbers, the students were getting pretty modest force outcomes. So typical peak forces in the region of 3 to 4 times body weight across unilateral and bilateral exercises, whereas the elite track and field guys were getting 6, 7, 8, 9, even more, maybe up to 10 times body weight on the same exercises. And when you think about those numbers for the non-elite guys, those are not big forces. Those are typical of what you'd expect to see when someone's running. And then you go to your standard plyometric guidelines, which still fairly ubiquitous as far as I'm aware, of limiting your session to 80 to 100 contacts, or 100 to 120, whatever it may be. That depth jumping is this high intensity exercise that's going to take 3 or 4 days to recover. It's going to smash your central nervous system. And then you think back to your 15-year-old female hockey player in the gym jumping 35 centimeters off a box into the air, thinking, well, she seems pretty fine to go again tomorrow. Like, that's probably not going to annihilate her central nervous system. And so fundamentally, those guidelines apply. If you are the high jumper who's just jumped off a box and applied 10 times body weight through the floor, well, yeah, you probably are going to be smashed, and you probably do need typical recovery rates as prescribed classically, and again is drawn back from those guys in the 60s. But for the vast majority of normal athletes that aren't trained strength power athletes, those guidelines probably don't apply at all, and yet nobody seems happy to challenge them. So the way I view it now is, I don't talk about intensity, I talk about intensity opportunity. And what I mean by that is, if I put down a 100 kilo bar, and I deadlift it and you deadlift it, we've done the same thing. Whereas if I put a 50 centimeter box down the track and you drop jump off it and I drop jump off it, let's say you're an elite power athlete, I'm sure you are, Rob.
Of course.
Then unlike the barbell example, we can't say that we've done the same thing. So there's an opportunity for intensity by jumping off that box, but it doesn't come as standard. So I can only take advantage of that opportunity if I've got sufficient strength to resist yielding and apply propulsive force. So again, if I step that box up, from the evidence I've collected on the non-elite guys, say we go to a meter box, I can't automatically say that's more intense, because the likelihood is I'm not going to be able to tolerate that. I'm going to give way to yielding to a greater extent, and therefore the peak force that my body has to tolerate doesn't actually change that much. So that's a fundamental finding for me, and when you say it out loud, it's kind of stating the obvious, but and some people might challenge you with that, but how many people actually apply that learning in their practice? I'm not sure there's that many. Similarly, I think you need to have some kind of banding to compare your exercises. So, for example, impulse is really compelling. So impulse is incredibly consistent across repetitions, with a very small standard deviation and a high level of reliability. But the reason I've discarded that in favour of peak force is twofold. One is that impulse isn't actually a measure of intensity; it's a measure of volume load. If you think about it, it's how hard you went, but also how long you went. So it's almost volume load within a single repetition. The other thing is that peak force. So peak force is a true measure of the highest intensity that you are subjected to, but also by converting that into relative peak force and expressing it in body weights, that's far easier for coaches, practitioners, and athletes to get their head around, and more user friendly than is Newton seconds. and it doesn't take as much time to process that data and come up with a number either. So for all those reasons, plus a couple more, peak force is probably the most usable metric. Now, the other thing is, like I say, you can only compare apples with apples. So, for example, if I'm going off, say, a 30 centimetre drop jump, and I'm an elite athlete, and I apply 4 times body weight, and then the next time I go off a 60 centimetre box and I apply 8 times body weight, doing 2 of the 30 centimetre box is not the same, clearly, as one of the 60 centimetre box. So you can't just do as you would do in strength training and regard it as all homogenous and kind of mix it all up and put it together and go, that's my total level of stress with a session. So it's something that I'm still working on, but some kind of bandwidth of whether that's really simplistic of high, medium or low, or within a certain number of body weights, but that's fundamentally vital for being able to compare intensities across sessions and across exercises.
I'm really sorry to absolutely drag it down to my level, but we're talking about a lot of data that's collected with force plates.
Yeah.
So for the guy that's not got access to the force plates before all your fabulous work is actually finished, what is the best way to be quantifying plyometrics up until then?
Well, if you haven't got a force plate, Rob, you're dead to me. It's a really good point, and it's something that someone's asked me in the past. My answer to that would be that I think gold standard. Well, gold standard is probably not attainable. Gold standard would be that you probably need to be able to measure every repetition, but for a bunch of reasons, that's not practical. I think it would be, where possible, it would be useful to have some kind of indication of your plyometric strength levels, as I would call them. So what's someone actually capable of applying? So you've got a half decent educated guess of what's going to happen when they go off a box. Failing that, which I accept is still reality for probably more coaches than it isn't. I think as the findings come out and as I publish stuff, and you get some kind of idea of what level of athlete will be able to produce, making an assumption that, okay, well, my guy sounds most like this guy, so that's probably what he's going to go and apply. So, like I say, what I've found is, recreationally active strength and conditioning students are putting 3 to 4 times body weight through. Even pretty talented footballers maybe pushing up towards 5.5 times body weight on the majority of these exercises, and then high jumpers, triple jumpers, sprinters, etc. Certainly at national and international level, you're talking different gravy, but that should give you a reasonable indication of what your guy is going to do. Certainly would move you beyond, at the moment, just going off a kind of a one size fits all. Drop jumps are really intense. You need 5 days off, kind of.
Cool, very interesting. So I just want to kind of round it up, but I know that you've got a second book out. So do you want to tell us the kind of thought behind the book, what it's about, and where people can get it and when they can get it?
Yeah, sure. I guess in some ways it's very different to the triathlon book, and in some ways it's very similar. So the reason I think it's similar is that it just tries to take a step back and go, what actually will make a difference in this sport, and how can we construct a strength and conditioning program around that? It's written primarily for coaches. The publisher won't thank me for saying that. I wanted to call it strength and conditioning for professional football or for elite football, because it's written for people working in a professional environment primarily, as opposed to, whereas the triathlon one is more about a weekend warrior can pick that up and get some idea of strength and conditioning, as well as hopefully strength and conditioning coaches. I don't expect everyone in Sunday League football to read this and try and get better, partly just because that's not that particular creature. Although hopefully you would still learn something if you were interested in strength and conditioning. But fundamentally it came about, so Dave Redding presented to us when I was an EIS S&C coach quite a few years ago, and talked about this concept of writing your own book. If you're a strength and conditioning coach, write your book. What would the chapters be? What would go into your book? And really build your own system, which I think is unbelievably good advice. I took that on pretty much from the next day that he said that, and I always recommend strength and conditioning coaches do that. So it just allows you to build your own systems and your own philosophies. And as Dave pointed out at the time, if you've got that and you've got a proper system that you understand, you're not going to be as subjected to the ebb and flow of go to a conference and someone presents their paradigm and you sort of fling all the way over this way, and then the next day you hear something else. You can basically look at it, hold it up and contrast it to your system, work out if and how you can assimilate any ideas of that into your own system, or reject or accept them on that basis, and you've got something consistent that you understand. And that's something I tried to do throughout my 3 years at West Brom, was continually build up systems. And you don't get a huge amount of player contact time in football, certainly not in the gym, and so I was constantly trying to make it a live experiment, as much for my own interest as much as anything else. It would have been reasonably easy to just sort of pedal stuff through, and nobody was at a hugely advanced level of strength and conditioning, so I continued to try to build these systems, and I put together a philosophy document of about 20,000 words. And then at the end of it, it just got to the point where I thought it would be nice to sort of draw that all together. So there were certain chapters that I felt I hadn't quite finished off, or that I could expand. And when it was just for my own interest, it didn't really merit spending an afternoon writing stuff that I knew I already knew. But it's quite nice to sort of put it all together. And having gone through the process of writing the triathlon book, I was fairly confident of the process of doing that. And it's rare that you get that opportunity to sort of sit down and really not just have the stuff that you think off the top of your head, but really go, okay, what do I properly think about developing running mechanics or preventing hamstring injuries? And I'm sure everybody listening to this will relate to this. Anyone who's ever done a presentation or written something for public consumption, that you tend to write these things with your biggest critic reading it in mind. So you want to make sure that it's half decent, and so anyone who chooses to be a detractor from you doesn't have any ammunition, because you're kind of exposing yourself by putting it out there, because it's probably even worse than presentations. Actually, there's no right of reply if someone's sat there on their sofa reading your book and they decide that it's a load of old pony. You're not going to be there to defend yourself, so you need to do a good job first time out. So that's fundamentally what it's about. And I was lucky that I had a really strong brief of, when I went into West Brom, of this is how you're going to have an impact, and it's kind of written along those lines, that this is how I see people benefiting football. So much like triathlon, I think there's huge things that strength and conditioning coaches, and when I say that in this context, I'm talking about gym-based strength and conditioning primarily, and I do talk about that in the book, whether you can be a generalist or not. But I think that there's a huge benefit in that, and you can bring a huge amount to a team, but you need to understand why and how, and you need to know what you're doing. It's not just going to happen by chance. I think too often coaches end up doing stuff that's not really movement, it's not really injury prevention, it's not really strength training. It's what I call that sort of grey mulch, when there's sort of someone's doing a very, very average squat with a very, very average weight, and you think, well, what you're actually changing there, what you're really improving, because they've just kind of done some stuff because they could get away with it, rather than really nailing down, this is what I'm going to achieve here.
So when's the book out, Mark?
Very good point. I'm glad you asked. It is. It's officially released on the 2nd of July, but I'm reliably informed that it is available for pre-order on Amazon now. Is the shameless plug?
Cool. No, I'll not shameless at all. I'll put a link up on the site so people can pre-order or wait and order or do whatever they wish. So you're on Twitter as well?
I am.
Yes. People can catch you on there.
Yeah, at MMJ Training.
Happy days. So I'll put the link on the site so people can ask you questions and on the back of the episode or about the book, and I'm sure you'd be happy to answer people on there.
Always happy to get involved in the dialogue, mate.
Cool. Well, I'll round it up there and just thank you for your time. It's been great to chat, and after all these number 39, 40, whatever it may be, when it actually goes out, I actually realised that I know absolutely jack shit. So that's cool. I'm all right with that.
Absolute pleasure, and I won't be offended. It took you 38 people before me to get an invite.
No worries, mate. All right, thanks very much for your time.
Cheers.
See you, pal. Bye. thanks for tuning in to episode 38 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. You can check out all that's going on in the podcast if you go to paceyperformance.co.uk, and you can check out all the links mentioned in the episode at paceyperformance.co.uk/38. You can also follow me on Twitter at PaceyPerform and keep up to date with everything that's going on in the podcast, amongst other things on there. And I will see you in episode 39.